Let's ask a pretty wild question. What if the American presidency was completely transformed? We're going to walk through a scenario, a kind of blueprint for a much more powerful executive branch. And it's one that could seriously reshape the balance of power in the US for a long, long time. Okay, so let's really dive into this thought experiment. Just imagine for a second a future where the president has way more direct authority than we've ever seen before. A world where federal agencies, the budget, even emergency powers are all centralized right there in the White House. What would that even look like? Now, let's be super clear about something. This isn't a prediction, it's an explainer. We're looking at a speculative scenario that's been pieced together from some very real proposals out there to reshape the executive branch. Our job here is just to understand how it could work and what the fallout might be from such a huge shift. So, what's the big idea behind this whole transformation? Well, it all comes down to a vision of government that's supposed to be more efficient, more directly accountable to one single leader, the president. The source material we're looking at really lays out a four-part strategy to get this done. First up, you centralize authority. That means bringing agencies that have traditionally been independent right under the White House's thumb. Second, you give the president a much stronger grip on the federal budget. Third, you expand the use of emergency powers for big domestic policies, not just for, say, a foreign crisis. And finally, you work to change the whole culture in Washington so that quick executive action is seen as the new normal, instead of slow-moving debate in Congress. So this is where it gets really interesting. This isn't just some vague idea. The scenario lays out a step-by-step blueprint for how this power could actually be consolidated. It's not a single event, but a methodical, deliberate process. All right, so the plan goes something like this. Step 1, centralize the federal agencies to make them more politically responsive. Step 2, expand the president's power to move money around that Congress has already approved. Step 3, and this one is absolutely crucial, is to get the courts on board by appointing judges who are sympathetic to this stronger view of executive power. And then finally, Step 4, make using emergency declarations to push through policy seem totally normal, like it's just how business gets done. Okay, before we get into the potential impacts, we have to take a second and talk about this core concept, checks and balances. The whole idea is to stop any one branch of government from getting too powerful. Every single proposal we've just talked about directly bumps up against this principle, which is exactly why it's at the very heart of this whole debate. So let's talk consequences. If all of this happened, what would it actually feel like on the ground? How would it change things? Not just here at home, but around the whole world. This is where it gets into a much bigger debate about how we should even be governed. Domestically, you've got this massive trade-off. On one hand, supporters would argue for incredible efficiency. I mean, imagine huge changes to laws, to trade deals, to infrastructure projects, all happening almost overnight without getting bogged down on Congress. But on the other side of the coin, critics are warning about way less accountability. If Congress has less oversight, the worry is that political divisions could get even worse, and maybe even civil liberties could be in danger. And you see this exact same tension when it comes to the economy and the flow of information. The argument for it is that a president with centralized spending power could take decisive action, reshaping entire markets and making sure big companies fall in line with national goals. But the argument against is that this same power could give the White House way more control over what federal agencies say, and that could really damage public trust in those institutions. This debate doesn't stop at the water's edge either. On the world stage, some of our allies might actually like the idea of a president who can make quick, unilateral decisions. It could give the U.S. more leverage in negotiations. But, and it's a big but, many of our other Democratic partners could be deeply unsettled by a U.S. president who isn't really constrained by their own legislature anymore. And that could lead to a lot of uncertainty and instability. So, here's the billion-dollar question. What does all this mean for the future? Are we talking about a temporary power boost for one administration, or are we looking at something much, much more permanent? The source material is pretty clear on this point. It argues that once these changes are made and then backed up by the courts, they wouldn't just be for one term. They could fundamentally rewrite the rules of power in Washington, setting a brand new, much more powerful precedent for every president who comes after, no matter what party they're from. And there's a line from the source that just hits the nail on the head. It says, one man's vision could leave a legacy that lasts far longer than his term. And that really gets to the heart of it. It shows how the vision of just one administration could potentially reshape a country's founding principles for decades, maybe even generations. And that leaves us with one last, really big question to chew on. The American system has been around for over 200 years. It's bent, but it hasn't broken. But this scenario really forces us to ask, Just how resilient are democratic structures when they're faced with a serious, determined push to change them from the ground up?